Hey guys, and welcome back to The Path of Flame by Yodepalma. Chapter 3. All Eyes on Me. Harry woke up the next morning to find that the window between his and Draco's beds looked out onto a view of the lake of all things. He would have liked to have taken it in for a while to see if he could spot any fish, but Draco chose that moment to throw a balled-up sock at him. "Get up!" he demanded. Harry glared at him before he slipped his glasses on and sat up in the bed with a yawn. "You're going to make us late for breakfast if you don't get up now." "Oh, shut up!" Harry snapped, though he finally did get out of bed. Draco grimaced at him, probably unimpressed with his early morning rudeness, but Harry ignored it as he pulled on his uniform. He frowned at the green and silver tie that had appeared overnight, but since he couldn't think of any way to get out of wearing it, he pulled it around his neck and tied it half-heartedly. Brushing by Draco, he stepped into the bathroom. "Potter!" Draco called through the door a couple of minutes later, making Harry sigh around his toothbrush. Hastily finishing his morning routine, he darted back into the dormitory to snatch up his wand and throw his books into a bag. "If you're so worried about breakfast, you could go down without me," Harry suggested irritably as Draco watched him with an amused smirk. "But how else would I get such amusement in the morning?" Draco asked. "Your tie's crooked, by the way." "I'll fix it at breakfast," Harry said impatiently. "They give us tea, don't they? I don't know why, but I'm still exhausted." Draco shrugged, obviously not knowing since neither of them had been to breakfast in the castle yet, and led the way out of the room. Crabbe and Goyle were waiting for them in the common room, lounging on a comfortable-looking leather couch, and they fell into step behind Draco and Harry without speaking. It was kind of weird having someone follow at his shoulder who wasn't his dad poking at him, but Harry didn't make any complaints. He figured it was just part of being forced into being Draco Malfoy's friend. And once they found their way to the Great Hall, he even managed to find himself almost grateful for their presence. The whispers started up again as soon as they entered, students pointing at him from across the room as he found a spot on the end of the Slytherin table. When he glanced over at Draco, he noticed the blonde boy was smirking smugly, probably enjoying the attention much more than Harry was himself. Harry just did his best to ignore it all, grabbing some food and a much-needed cup of tea, with feigned casualness. "You know, you could at least pretend you're trying to be my friend for something other than my fame," Harry muttered to Draco under his breath. Draco managed to arrange his features into an innocent look, and Harry laughed a little. Who was he trying to fool? Their schedules came down the table eventually, handed off by their sour-faced head of house. Harry made a face at the timetable the first years were given. They had Transfiguration first thing that morning. What an awful class to start Monday out with. When Harry looked up from the parchment, his eyes scanned across the staff table automatically, and he was surprised to find Professor Snape glaring back at him. The man had glared at him all through the feast last night as well, making Harry a little discomfited to find him still stuck under that gaze. Fortunately, Snape looked away quickly to continue his conversation with Quirrell. "What does Professor Snape have against me?" Harry wondered aloud as he started fixing his tie. "He keeps glaring at me." "I have no idea," Draco replied casually. "Come on and hurry up with your tie. We don't want to get on McGonagall's bad side on the first day of class." The whispers that had greeted him on entering the Great Hall only got worse through the day as he travelled the hallways at Draco's side. He could hear many of the students speculating about his choice of friend. Yeah, as if Draco had given him any choice. Murmuring behind their hands about Lucius Malfoy's previous time as a Death Eater, and the entire family's penchant for dark magic, and their belief in pureblood supremacy. But he did his best to ignore them as he focused on memorising the layout of the castle. Classes weren't always much better, unfortunately. While McGonagall seemed no-nonsense enough to treat him like any other student, Professor Flitwick actually fell over in excitement when he came across Harry's name when calling roll. Fortunately, the excitement seemed to die down a little as the week went by. Most of the teachers seemed to genuinely like him, even McGonagall, who had told Harry that he was the quickest student to turn his match into a needle. And Harry kept his head down and worked hard so he wouldn't have any confrontations with any of the other students. Some of the Gryffindors seemed to be going out of their way to be rude to him, though. Ron Weasley and Seamus Finnegan seemed particularly disgusted with the house he'd ended up in, and a couple of the older Gryffindors had cornered him one of the few times he'd managed to tear Draco away from him. Of course, they only learnt the hard way that Roy Mustang's son was not someone to mess with. His dad had taught him several dueling spells, and Ed had been coaching him in martial arts. So he'd only come out of that confrontation with a split lip and a detention courtesy of the Gryffindor prefect, who hadn't believed he was just defending himself. By the time Friday rolled around, he was fed up with the prejudice he was faced with, and more than ready for the weekend to come. He was starting to draft a letter home to his dad and Ed when Blaze dropped into the seat across from him. "Potions with the Gryffindors this morning," he said morosely, and Harry groaned. The last thing he wanted to deal with was Ron and Seamus's accusations, first thing on a Friday morning. And to top that off, he still wasn't sure what to make of Snape. The potions professor had stopped glaring at him on the morning, but he still stared more than Harry would have liked. Still, there was no avoiding the class, so when the rest of the Slytherin first years got up to leave, he followed without complaint. Snape only paused briefly after calling Harry's name for roll, but once he'd finished his welcoming speech, Harry's respite seemed to be over. "Potter!" he barked so suddenly that Harry had to grab the edge of the table to stop himself from jumping. "What would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of woodworm?" Harry's eyebrows furrowed as he tried to recall the answer. The Drought of Living Death, sir," he replied uncertainly. "Good," Snape said slowly. "And where would you look if I asked you to find a bezoar?" Biting his lip to keep himself from blurting, "The potions cupboard!" he scratched the top of his head as he tried to remember the answer. "I don't recall, sir, but I know what it's used for." When the professor raised a questioning eyebrow at him, he continued, "It's an antidote for most poisons, and it's used in antidote potions, sir." Snape hummed thoughtfully and tapped his finger against his desk. "Let's try one more, then. What is the difference, Potter, between monk's hood and wolfsbane?" This one Harry actually didn't even have to think about. They're the same plant, sir, and it's also known as aconite. He'd thought that plant was rather pretty for a poison, which is probably why he remembered the strange names. "Correct," Snape said shortly, finally turning his gaze from Harry to address the rest of the class. "A bezoar, for everyone's information, is a stone found in the stomach of a goat. Mr. Potter was correct about its uses, including its purpose as an ingredient in several powerful antidotes." "Well, why aren't you copying that all down?" Over the flurry of activity as the class pulled out parchment and quills, Snape glanced over at Harry one more time with a sour look on his face. "And 3 points to Slytherin for the information Mr. Potter so kindly provided us today." Snape put them into pairs to mix up a potion to cure boils, and walked around the room criticising almost everyone's work. He seemed to like Draco enough to give compliments, but Harry, who was working with Draco, only received thin-lipped glares whenever the professor stopped by while he was dutifully following the book's directions. When Snape directed the class's attention to Draco's apparently perfect work, blatantly ignoring Harry's very presence as he did so, he was interrupted by clouds of green smoke. Harry looked around to find that Neville Longbottom had somehow managed to melt Seamus's cauldron, which Harry hadn't thought would even be possible with such a simple potion, and was now drenched in the incomplete potion. Snape swept over to them with a snarl on his face to berate Neville and tell Seamus to take him up to the hospital wing, as he quickly vanished the acid-like potion that was spreading across the floor. Harry returned to his work as Seamus gathered his and Neville's things, determined to keep his and Draco's potion perfect, and didn't pay them much attention as they were starting to leave. He was carefully dropping porcupine quills into the cauldron when the pair passed him, and Seamus pretended to trip, bumping into Harry's elbow. "Shit!" Harry snarled under his breath as the quills he was holding slipped out of his grip and into the cauldron, and Draco snapped a much louder, "Watch what you're doing, Finnegan!" Snape whirled on them, scowling at Harry and Draco glaring viciously at Seamus's slowly disappearing back. He took one look at their cauldron and seemed to deduce what had happened as he shouted, 5 points from Gryffindor for interfering with another student's potion, Finnegan. The Gryffindor side of the room erupted in complaints, Weasley loudly proclaiming that Snape had no proof that Seamus had done anything. "Are you telling me how to run my class, Weasley?" Snape asked in a furiously cold voice, looming menacingly over the tall redhead. Weasley quickly shook his head, eyes wide. "Good. Then all of you get back to work." "Finnegan is a menace," Harry said to Draco later that afternoon as they lounged in the common room, avoiding their homework. He had his letter to his dad with him, but he wasn't working on it yet. He was still debating whether he should complain about the bullying problems. "You'd think he'd have better things to do with his time than to mess with me, wouldn't you?" "The Gryffindors are always like that with Slytherins, I've heard," Blaise said. He was leaning against the arm of the couch with his feet upon Pansy's lap, eyes closed as he soaked up the heat from the fire. Pansy, nose in a book, was studiously ignoring him. "Some of the upperclassmen tried to hex Noct yesterday. Did you hear? Apparently he was too close to the entrance to the Gryffindor common room for their comfort." "Is he okay?" Harry asked, mostly because he was the only one who would. Theodore was relatively quiet and never bothered anyone, which meant that nobody bothered with him either. "He's fine. Went to Pomfrey with a headache or something. The Gryffindors got the wrong end of his wand, though." "Is there a right end of someone else's wand to get?" Pansy asked lazily, flinging her book onto the table in front of her with an annoyed grimace. "Merlin, I wish the history of magic books weren't just as boring as Binns's. I've read the chapter twice, and I still don't have any idea what he was going on about with the goblins yesterday. Who even cares about goblins anyway?" "People who keep the money in Gringotts, I reckon," Harry replied smartly. "Which is, only the entire wizarding community here." "Speaking of Gringotts," Draco interrupted as Pansy glared at Harry. He waved a copy of the Daily Prophet in the air impatiently. "The goblins are saying that nothing was taken during that break-in. Can you believe it? Apparently the vault was empty that very same morning." "There was a break-in at Gringotts?" Harry asked curiously, snatching the paper from Draco. Draco kicked him, then pointed out the article in question. "Hey, that happened on my birthday." Yeah," Blaise said slowly. "Where have you been, Potter?" In a mistress, where I wouldn't have received the prophet to find out about any of this," Harry said pointedly, handing the newspaper back to Draco. "Maybe I should get a subscription. I probably don't want to lose track of everything that's going on in England while I'm at home." "Don't trust us to keep you updated?" Draco asked sarcastically. Harry rolled his eyes at him but didn't respond. "Anyway, I was going to ask, what do you think was in that vault? Couldn't have been much, or there's no way they wouldn't have gotten away, dark wizard or not." "Probably a really rare artifact," Pansy said, leaning forward and using Blaise's legs to prop her chin up on her hand. Blaise squirmed uncomfortably but didn't make any move to dislodge her. "Why are you taking such an interest in this, Draco? Going to catch the culprit yourself?" "Hardly," Draco snorted, throwing the paper on the floor. "Do I look like a Gryffindor to you? I just want to know what it was. Doesn't anybody else think it's weird that the third-floor corridor is out of bounds at the same time a supposedly impossible break-in at Gringotts happens? Everyone says there was nothing wrong with it until this year." "You think Dumbledore's keeping something Gringotts couldn't keep safe in the school?" Harry asked doubtfully. "Doesn't seem very sensible to me." But Dumbledore was supposed to be the only person that you-know-who was ever scared of," Blaise said loftily. "And he's defeated plenty of dark wizards before. The worst was Grindelwald back in the 40s, though. Do you know anything about him? And the headmaster's getting pretty old, even for a wizard. Still, I wouldn't doubt that he's buying into his own press." "Powerful or not, he still sounds crazy," Harry said stubbornly, and finally pulled his letter to Roy a bit closer to him. This was something he knew he should tell him, if only so his dad could send him a sarcastic reply back. Dad says overconfidence is the quickest path to defeat. If the headmaster is hiding something in Hogwarts, I better get stolen before the year's out. We should go check out what's in there, Draco said, leaning over Harry's shoulder. What are you writing? You've had that parchment out all day. It's a letter to my dad, Harry replied, elbowing Draco until the blonde grumpily backed off. You heard him tell me to write him within a week, didn't you? Do you always do what your dad tells you to? Blaze asked curiously, not actually looking in Harry's direction. That's adorable. Shut up, Harry muttered with a blush. If I don't write him, he'll get worried. And then he'll probably come up here with half the army behind him. Or even worse, just a pissed off Ed and Major Hawkeye. I do not want Hawkeye glaring at me for worrying him. Is this Hawkeye part of your dad's scary team? Pansy asked, voice only slightly mocking. You sound terrified of him. She is the one I know is a squib, Harry replied pointedly. She helped Dad out a lot when I was younger, but you don't know fear until you've seen that woman behind the trigger of a rifle pointed in your direction. Not that Hawkeye was actually aiming at him, of course. He'd been kidnapped once, and notably, only once, a few years back, before Ed and Al had moved in. Harry honestly didn't remember much of it himself. The only clear image he could bring up was Hawkeye with a rifle, coldly standing behind his uncharacteristically expressive dad, who was furiously demanding Harry's release if the kidnappers wanted to live. One of them laughed in Roy's face. None of them had survived. Harry had been in therapy for years after that. Was she going to shoot you? Pansy asked with a terrified squeak. Oh no, just the guys who were holding me hostage, Harry answered as casually as he could. Hawkeye would never shoot me. Dad would be way too upset. And she likes me anyway. I think. You think? Draco echoed sarcastically. Your country is so weird. Says the man who was surprised I'd never eaten food that literally tries to run away from you, Harry retorted, smiling a little at the snort of amusement he received from Blaze. Then he finally turned back to his letter, deciding, with some reluctance, that he'd best tell Roy about the Gryffindors after all. His dad would be upset if he found out from someone other than Harry. As he was writing and repeatedly shoving Draco off him from poking his nose into Harry's business, Crabbe and Goyle lumbered into the room from wherever in the castle they'd been. Goyle came right over to them, gingerly perching himself on the arm of the couch as if he were worried it would collapse under his weight. But Crabbe wandered over to check the notice board. Where have you two been? Draco asked Goyle, not really sounding as if he cared about the answer. Looking for the kitchens, Goyle replied with a sigh. Couldn't find 'em. Maybe next time, Draco murmured. Flying lessons this week, Crabbe grumbled as he came over to them, glaring at Blaze and Pansy taking up an entire couch. Draco moved closer to Harry's side of their couch. Harry quickly covered up his letter, and Goyle settled down on the far end with a grunt. Doubling with the Gryffindors starting Thursday. Oh, lovely, Harry said sarcastically. You'd think once a week in the dungeons with them would be more than enough trouble for the teachers, wouldn't you? Unfortunately, by that Thursday it was obvious that the teachers hadn't figured out how bad of an idea that combined class was, because the notice about flying lessons remained unchanged that morning. Draco was especially put out by this, as he'd had some trouble with Finnegan just the day before, so Harry supposed he shouldn't have been surprised when the pale boy snatched something out of Neville Longbottom's hand on the way out of the Great Hall that morning. Ron Weasley and Seamus Finnegan, who otherwise didn't give Neville the time of day, instantly jumped to their feet for a fight. Harry just rolled his eyes and snatched the little glass orb from Draco's hand. I was looking at that, Draco protested. Most people ask permission before taking things from people's hands, Draco, Harry said with a sigh, tossing the ball back to Neville, who caught it with wide eyes. Come on, we're going to be late for herbology. I hate herbology, Draco grumbled half-heartedly, but agreeably followed Harry out of the door. Later that afternoon found the Slytherins outside on the grounds, waiting for both the Gryffindors and Madam Hooch to show up for their lesson. They had already found the best brooms of the lot, at Harry's insistence, and had rearranged them so the Gryffindors would get the worst ones, when the rest of the class showed up with Weasley in the lead. Weasley and Finnegan glared at them heatedly, probably not having forgiven Draco for trying to take Neville's toy earlier in the day. But they didn't get a chance to start anything before Hooch appeared and ordered them all to stand by their brooms. "Now, stick out your right hand over your broom and say 'up,'" she told them. "Up," the class dutifully repeated. Harry's broom leapt into his hand and he grinned at Draco. Draco grinned back, smugly holding his own broom and eyeing the rest of the class with some amusement. A couple of Gryffindors were also holding their brooms already, and Blaise managed to get his in his hand on the second try, but most of the class was still shouting at their brooms. Worst of all was Neville's, which was clearly responding to the boy's trembling voice and refusing to move at all. When everyone was finally mounted on their brooms, and Harry was never going to let Draco hear the end of Hooch saying he was gripping it wrong, Madame Hooch told them to kick off lightly on her whistle and immediately come back down. Harry and Draco grimaced at each other, neither appreciating the baby steps, but it quickly became obvious why they were necessary. Neville kicked off before Hooch had even blown her whistle, and as he shot quickly into the air, seemed too terrified to bring the broom back down on the teacher's orders. Harry couldn't help but wince sympathetically when Neville inevitably slid sideways off his broom and slammed into the ground. "Broken wrist," Hooch muttered as she leant over Neville's still terrified form. "Come on, boy, it's all right. Come on, up you get." Her voice turned harsh again when she turned to face the rest of the class to threaten them into staying on the ground. She walked off with her arm around Neville's shoulders. Beside Harry, Draco snorted with laughter. "Did you see his face, the great lump?" Then to Harry, who was scowling as the rest of the Slytherins joined in the laughter. "Come on, Harry. That was priceless. They should have known better than to let that walking disaster anywhere near a broom." "Shut up, Malfoy," one of the Gryffindor girls snapped, her pretty face twisted into a vicious frown. "Ooh, sticking up for Longbottom," Pansy mocked back. "Never thought you'd like fat little crybabies, Pravati." "Look," Draco said, darting forward and snatching something out of the grass. "It's that stupid thing Longbottom's Gran sent him." Weasley looked like he was preparing to attack Draco, so Harry stepped forward himself and grabbed the little glass ball from his friend's grip before he could get pummelled. He didn't say anything as he slid it into his pocket, though, instead levelling Draco with a glare. "Give it here, Potter!" Weasley yelled, looking a little less ready to attack Harry. He'd probably heard what Harry was capable of from the older Gryffindors, and had enough sense not to want to start a fight. "Oh, like you give a whit about Longbottom," Harry said shortly, his anger finally getting the better of him. "Do you actually plan on giving it back to him, or are you just trying to look big, picking a fight with, what did you call me the other day? Oh yeah, the Blood Traitor." "You're just another slimy Slytherin, Potter," Finnegan piped up from behind Weasley's back. "You can pretend to be noble all you want, but we know what you're really like." "Yeah, so give the Remember All back," Weasley said smugly. "I'll hold on to it for now, thanks," Harry said coldly, though his voice was shaking with fury at the Gryffindor's thinly veiled insults. "I don't trust you to actually give it back to him." "Yeah, I reckon you could get a few knuts for it if you tried to sell it instead," Draco said snidely. For whatever reason, this seemed to be the last straw for Weasley. He lunged at Draco with a snarl. Not that it did him any good. Harry yanked his friend away from the redhead by the back of his collar, and was just about to retaliate when a voice rang out over the grounds. "Mr. Weasley!" Professor McGonagall yelled as she ran over to the loose group. "How dare you attack another student?" "But, Professor, he was provoked," Parvati Patel spoke up hurriedly. "Be quiet, Miss Patel," McGonagall said furiously. "But Malfoy said—" "That's enough, Mr. Finnegan. There is no excuse for attacking another student. That's 20 points from Gryffindor, Mr. Weasley, and a detention for next week. Don't argue, or that'll be more points." Most of the Slytherins were still smirking when McGonagall told them all to go back to the common rooms. Harry even made sure to give Weasley and Finnegan an extra sweet smile, which got him a few irate glares before the two boys bent their heads together and started whispering hurriedly. They were probably trying to come up with some way to get Harry and Draco into trouble, but Harry found he wasn't too bothered. He was sure nothing would come of it. "What are you actually going to do with Longbottom's stupid toy?" Draco asked, once the Gryffindors split away from them to head to their own common room. "That thing is useless." "Which explains why you were so keen to get a look at it," Harry said, somewhat coldly. He was still upset by Draco's cruelty earlier. Broken bones were nothing to laugh about, and wasn't feeling particularly friendly at the moment. "I'm going to head up to the hospital wing and give it back to Longbottom. He'll want to keep it if it's from his gran." "All the more reason to keep it, don't you think?" "Look!" Harry snapped, whirling round on Draco in a temper. Most of the Slytherin first years were arrayed behind the other boy, as if backing him up, and Harry shot them a brief glare before turning his attention back to his friend. "Maybe you don't get it. Maybe you haven't lost any family members, but I do. You never know when someone you love is going to die, and Neville's gran has got to be old. How do you think he would feel if the last thing she ever gave to him, he lost it? So I'm not going to ask you to go with me. I'm not even going to ask if you care, but I'm bringing this back to him because I know what it's like." "Harry, wait!" Draco called after him as he stormed off. But Harry was so angry at the blonde that he didn't even want to look at him, so he ignored it. His bad mood took him all the way up to the hospital wing, and for once he was glad that being a Slytherin meant nobody wanted anything to do with him. He stepped into the wing somewhat hesitantly, though, wary of coming across any Gryffindors who might have opted to visit their injured housemate. Thankfully the room was empty, save for Neville and Madame Pomfrey, who was gingerly moving Neville's arm. "Something I can help you with, Potter?" Madame Pomfrey asked when she finally caught sight of Harry sliding through the door. Blushing slightly, Harry stepped fully inside and closed the door behind him. "No, ma'am. I just wanted to see how he was doing," Harry said with a nod to Neville, shifting nervously on his feet. I wasn't sure if I thought he might want his remember-all back." "Well, he's all sorted out, so you can chat for a minute if you want," Madame Pomfrey said briskly, stepping away from Neville's bed. Harry watched her go, then pulled the remember-all out of his pocket and held it out to Neville, but when the boy failed to take it from him, he dropped it onto the bed instead. How's your arm?" he asked awkwardly. "It's fine," Neville replied warily. "Madame Pomfrey fixed it right up with a spell. It hardly even hurts now." He kept an eye on Harry as he slowly picked up the remember-all, inspecting it briefly before shoving it into one of his own pockets. "Why'd you return it?" "Well, it's yours, isn't it?" Harry said, nonplussed. "I'm not going to take something your gran gave you. You never know when... it probably means a lot to you, that she sent it to you and all." Harry's nervous babbling seemed to finally crack a smile out of Neville, whose eyes were starting to take on an amused glint. "I figured you'd be as bad as Malfoy," Neville said, his voice a lot more casual already. "You're always with him all the time." "Accident of fate," Harry suggested with a wry grin. "I met him over the summer in Diagon Alley, and now I can't get rid of him. He's a bit of a prat and really nosy, but he kind of grows on you after a while. Anyway, I figured you might as well get along with the guys you sleep in the same room with, you know?" Neville just laughed and nodded in agreement, so Harry took that as his cue to leave. He said his goodbyes somewhat hastily, wanting to leave before he could say something to really embarrass himself, and then darted out of the room. But despite everything, Harry soon discovered that he'd made himself a new and loyal friend out of Neville. Draco seemed particularly unimpressed with this, since Harry had started spending more time away from the Slytherin Commons to hang out with Neville. But Harry himself was pleased. Neville was the first friend he'd made on purpose in this new country, and Harry finally had someone to spend time with whenever one of his group of Slytherins said something ignorant. So that was Chapter 3 of The Path of Flame by Yodepalma. You have no idea how hard it was for me to not either sing the title of this chapter or say it quickly so it sounded funny when I rhymed it, but I knew that would probably annoy a lot of people, and it would probably annoy me as well. Either that or just make me laugh throughout the rest of the entire video. I'm also pretty sure I called Blaze Blake once or twice in the video. I think I caught them all, but I'm not sure, so whoops. Anyway, thank you again for joining me for Chapter 3, and I hope you'll join me again for Chapter 4, Let You Down.